This week has been an amazing week for me, and I hope that you guys also had an amazing week. So, before we get into the trades, I would like to say that this week alone, I made more than 10% of my overall equity. It's not my first time, but still, after a very long period of time, I mean, after the December's price action, it's been a very long time since I made around 10% in just a week. I mean, usually it goes around 2 to 3 weeks or a month, depending on the entire month's PA. But this week has been very amazing for me. And let's jump right into the trades. So, my first trade, right? The first trade that I took on was on Monday. My Monday's trade went as following. As you guys can see that Monday the market opened when the Monday market opened around 9:30. So we had an initial sketchy moments. The market went around to take the gap ORG gap that was still unfilled. So it took around 50% of the market, and there were quite some liquidity points on sell side. So my target was obviously towards the sell side liquidity, and I entered the trade quite perfectly. It was a continuation day, and I have started trading continuation as well. So if you guys take a look into my trade, right? So I entered my trade somewhere around 9:47. So the entry point of my trade, right, was exactly correct. But the problem with my trade was that I kept my SL quite tight. So I should have kept my SL a little more bigger. But in the heat of the moment, I guess I made my SL a little tighter, and therefore it hit my SL and then directly went for my TP. But it was a minimal loss, and I think I was fine with that. It was obviously my mistake. My trade setup was correct. The problem was that I didn't place my SL right, as you guys can see it. So this was my trade on Monday. Moving on, my second trade was on Tuesday. That is the 24th of February. My second trade on Tuesday. The initial market conditions on Tuesday were quite uh, huge. You could have, if you guys had been watching the Tuesday's market, I'm sure you would have noticed that the movement on Tuesday was quite very huge. We had a huge momentum candle on both sides, both the downwards as well as the upwards. So my overall target was, I was looking for the buy side, and since there was buy side liquidity there, we had a drawn liquidity on the top. So that was my target. I believe the drawn liquidity was the previous days high. Yeah. So my drawn liquidity was previous days high, and I targeted for it. So I didn't enter the initial macro, that is 950 to 1015. I waited around because that macro was quite choppy, and we had double-sided moves on that two huge moves on either side. So I waited around, and around the next macro, right, somewhere around nearing 11 p.m., I had my entry. So this was my entry, guys. I took a quick 1:1 trade because this entry, I was not very confident on this entry, but I was certain that the trade was going to hit my TP because we had a few equal highs here, and usually when an equal highs formation happens and we also have a drawn liquidity, it's almost guaranteed that it would go ahead and hit the profit. So it was quite an easy trade for me on Tuesday, and I made a 1:1 profit. Moving on, we'll go into my Wednesday's trade. I know this week, I mean, I have taken almost every day we have traded around except for Friday because due to personal reasons I had to skip. Now, to my Wednesday's trade. Wednesday's trade were quite awesome because the initial macro movement gave me enough to actually make quite a lump sum amount of profits. So when the macro began, right, it didn't respect the ORG gap. It directly went for the drawn liquidity, and I entered the trade somewhere around 9:45, I guess. Exactly around 9:45, I entered the trade. So it went around in quite a linear fashion, and the trade was quite simple as well. So I entered quite early on, It was just a 5 minutes before the macro because I had an assumption that if I were to wait for the macro, I would probably not get the trade. But if you guys had sat through the entire market session, I'm sure you would have gotten a trade in the PM session. The 11 a.m. macro was quite choppy, and I'm not sure anybody would have entered in that. But this is my trade, right? So I entered the market somewhere around here. I kept my SL in this array, and the market just went quite in an alien fashion. And I also made a second entry where we had a small retracement here, and this was my point of entry because this imbalance needed to be filled, and it was quite clear that we are going for the drawn liquidity. So I got a chance to enter right over here. So I took another 1:1 trade, and I made over around 4% of my entire equity in just one day. So now moving on to the final trade of this week, Thursdays. So my Thursdays trade, right? My Thursdays trade was almost quite easy. I do not know what are the words I can describe it because that's what it was. And my Thursdays trade began after I began my trading somewhere around after 10 o'clock, between the range of 10 o'clock and 10:15, because that was where we had quite the moment. So if you guys have noticed the Thursday's market, right? The market didn't respect the ORG gap. It went directly in a downwards fashion, and I waited for my entry, and somewhere around 10 o'clock, somewhere between 10:50 to 10:15, in that specific gap, if I have to be precise, right? I think it was somewhere around 10:49. No, sorry, not 10:49, 9:49. Entered my trade exactly right over here. I kept my SLs above the index of February 11 and 12. I waited for the market. The market initially went up again, tapped into those arrays, and then it pushed it down in quite a strong momentum. And that was the Thursday trade, which it took me around just 15 minutes, 10 minutes to hit the TP. And this trade made me another 4% of my entire equity. Thereby, I made 10% of my overall equity in just 1 week. So this is my trade for this week, guys. Hope you had an amazing week as well. If you did, comment down below, and let's see in the next video.